She never cried where he could hear her. Elena Morales had perfected the art of silent suffering, swallowing her sobs in supply closets, letting tears fall only when the vacuum drowned them out, timing her breakdowns to the rhythm of Marcus Kane's predictable absences. But on this October afternoon, when her baby's fever spiked to 104 and his tiny chest struggled for each rattling breath, silence became impossible. If you're enjoying this story and want more emotional journeys that will touch your heart, hit that subscribe button. The marble floors of the Kane mansion gleamed like ice beneath her knees as she cradled 6-month-old Mateo against her chest, his burning skin soaking through her gray uniform. She'd hidden him in the service quarters all morning, praying the fever would break, knowing she couldn't afford to lose this job, couldn't afford the emergency room, couldn't afford the truth that was killing her. Her son was dying, and she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Por favor, Diosito, she whispered into his damp curls, rocking in the nursery, the one room Marcus Kane never entered, the one room that held too many ghosts. Por favor, not my baby. Not like this. She didn't hear the front door open 2 hours early. She didn't hear the Italian leather shoes on the stairs. She didn't hear anything except Mateo's labored breathing and her own heart shattering. 6 hours earlier, Elena's alarm pierced the pre-dawn darkness at 4:47 a.m. 13 minutes before it needed to, but she'd learned that those 13 minutes meant the difference between composed and catastrophic. In the efficiency apartment she shared with her mother and Van Nuys, every second was calculated, every movement choreographed to keep the fragile machinery of their lives from collapsing. Mateo stirred in the bassinet beside her mattress on the floor, making the small mewling sounds that meant he'd wake fully in minutes. Elena pressed her palm to his forehead, warm but not alarming. Not yet. Mijo, she breathed, lifting him gently, his small body fitting perfectly in the crook of her arm. 6 months old, with her dark eyes and a smile that could make her forget, for whole seconds at a time, that his father had disappeared the moment she'd whispered the word, pregnant. Her mother, Rosa, was already awake in the kitchenette, heating a bottle. At 63, Rosa moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had been worn down by decades of cleaning other people's homes. She didn't speak as she handed Elena the bottle. Words cost energy they couldn't spare at this hour. He felt warm last night, Rosa said finally, her voice scraped raw from exhaustion. Did you check? It's nothing, Elena lied. Because the alternative was calling in sick. And calling in sick meant no pay. And no pay meant the electricity bill went unpaid. And unpaid bills meant she stopped the domino chain of catastrophe before it could finish falling in her mind. I'll keep him in the service room today, Elena said, settling into the apartment's single chair to feed Mateo. Mr. Kane has meetings until 8 tonight. He'll never know. Rosa's silence spoke volumes. They both knew the rules. No visitors, no distractions. No evidence of the messy, complicated life Elena lived beyond the gates of the Kane estate. Marcus Kane paid well, $4,200 a month, which was generous for domestic work, but the compensation came with an unspoken covenant of invisibility. Elena was expected to be a ghost who left no trace except perfectly arranged flowers and floors you could see your regrets in. What if he comes home early? Rosa asked. He won't. Elena spoke with a confidence she'd earned over 18 months of employment. Marcus Kane was nothing if not predictable. Tuesdays meant board meetings until 6, followed by dinner at Mastro's, followed by 2 hours in his home office reviewing reports that would determine the fates of people he'd never meet. He moved through his days with the whiz, mechanical precision of expensive clockwork, and Elena had learned to set her life to his rhythms. Mateo finished the bottle and immediately began to fuss, his small face scrunching in discomfort. Elena felt his forehead again, definitely warmer. I'll give him infant Tylenol, she said, standing. He'll be fine. But the tremor in her voice betrayed her, and Rosa's eyes, dark and knowing and weighted with the particular sadness of mothers who've watched their daughters struggle, held a question Elena couldn't answer. What if he's not fine? By 6:15 a.m., Elena was pulling her 15-year-old Honda into the service entrance of the Kane estate in Bel Air, Mateo drowsing fitfully in his car seat behind her. The mansion rose against the morning sky, like a monument to everything she would never have. 12,000 square feet of glass and steel and carefully curated emptiness. She'd been working here since Matteo was a month old, since desperation had driven her to lie on her resume about having childcare arrangements. For 17 months she'd managed the impossible, raising an infant in the margins of a billionaire's life, nursing him during lunch breaks in the laundry room, changing diapers between polishing silver and preparing meals Marcus Kane rarely ate. The house had 6 bedrooms. Marcus Kane used one. It had a chef's kitchen with appliances that cost more than her car. He survived on takeout and protein shakes. It had a nursery on the 3rd floor, pale blue walls, a crib that had never held a child, stuffed animals arranged with the eerie precision of a museum display. Elena cleaned it every Thursday, and every Thursday she felt the weight of the grief that lived in that room like a physical presence. Marcus Kane's daughter had died there. Leukemia, Rosa had heard from another housekeeper in the neighborhood, 5 years old. The wife had left 6 months later, unable to breathe in a house that had become a mausoleum. That was 4 years ago, and Marcus had never changed a single thing in that room. Elena never brought Matteo to the 3rd floor, until today. She carried him through the service entrance, his diaper bag slung over her shoulder, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was definitely hotter now, his small body radiating heat that scared her more than she wanted to admit. The Tylenol hadn't touched the fever. Just one day she bargained with God, with fate, with whatever force might be listening. Just let him make it through today, and I'll take him to the clinic tonight, please. The house was silent in the way only truly empty houses can be, not peaceful, but hollow, like a held breath. Elena moved through the kitchen, the great room, the hallways lined with abstract art worth more than she'd earn in a lifetime, heading for the service quarters, where she'd set up a makeshift area for Matteo on previous desperate days. But the service quarters were being fumigated today, she'd forgotten, distracted by Matteo's fever and her own exhaustion. The smell of chemicals hit her like a wall, and she backed away quickly, covering Matteo's face with her hand. Think, the nursery. The room Marcus never entered. The room that existed in a separate plane of reality from the rest of his carefully controlled life. She'd be able to hear him if he came home early, which he wouldn't, and the air purifier in there would help Matteo breathe easier. Elena climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, each step feeling like a small betrayal, like she was crossing an invisible boundary that shouldn't be crossed. But Matteo whimpered against her chest, and maternal instinct overrode everything else. The nursery door opened soundlessly. She'd oiled the hinges herself last week. Inside, the room was exactly as she'd left it, perfect, untouched, frozen in time like an insect in amber. Afternoon sunlight would stream through the western windows, warming the space by evening. She could set up Matteo's portable bassinet in the corner, behind the rocking chair, where he'd be invisible if anyone glanced in from the hallway. She worked quickly, arranging the bassinet, laying out changing supplies, filling a bottle with the formula she'd brought. Matteo had stopped crying, not because he felt better, but because he'd exhausted himself. That scared her more than the crying had. "Está bien, mi amor," she whispered, settling him into the bassinet, tucking his thin blanket around him. "Mommy's here. Everything's gonna be okay." But his skin was scalding now, and his breathing had taken on a shallow, rapid quality that made something primal and terrified rise in her throat. She pressed the bottle to his lips. He turned away. She tried again. He wouldn't eat. The morning dissolved into a blur of routines, performed on autopilot while her mind remained tethered to the 3rd floor. Elena cleaned the already clean kitchen, arranged fresh flowers in the entryway, white orchids, Marcus's preference, elegant and emotionless. She vacuumed the great room, polished the glass coffee table, straightened the books on the shelf that no one read. Every 20 minutes, she climbed the stairs to check on Matteo. At 10:30, his fever was 102. At 12:15, it was 103. At 2 o'clock it was 104, and he'd stopped moving entirely, just lying in the bassinet with his eyes half open, staring at nothing. Elena stood frozen in the doorway, her phone in her hand, her mind racing through calculations she'd made 1,000 times. Emergency room copay, $250. Ambulance, if he got worse, $800. Tests, medications, possible hospital stay, thousands she didn't have, debt she couldn't climb out of, the beginning of the end of their precarious stability. But none of that mattered if She couldn't finish the thought. Her fingers were dialing 911 when she heard it, the distinctive purr of Marcus Kane's Bentley in the driveway, 2 hours early. Elena's heart stopped. She canceled the call, shoved the phone in her pocket, and looked around the nursery with rising panic. She couldn't let him find them here. Couldn't let him see that she'd violated the invisible rules. Couldn't. Matteo made a sound then, not a cry, but something worse. A weak, wheezing exhale that sounded like giving up. And Elena's world narrowed to a single, crystalline point of understanding. She didn't care about the job, didn't care about the rules, didn't care about anything except the fact that her baby was dying and she was out of time. She sank to her knees beside the bassinet, lifted Matteo's burning body against her chest, and let out a sound she'd been holding back for 6 hours, for 18 months, for her entire life of swallowing pain to survive. She sobbed, and the sound echoed through the empty nursery, through the silent house, through the carefully maintained fiction that Marcus Kane lived in a world where suffering could be kept at arm's length, through wealth and willpower and walls thick enough to keep the messy business of being human at bay. Downstairs, Marcus Kane stood in his entryway, his hand still on the door he'd just closed, listening to a sound he hadn't heard in 4 years. The sound of a mother breaking. Marcus Kane had built an empire on the principle that everything could be controlled. Markets, mergers, outcomes, all of it could be reduced to variables and managed through precise application of resources and will. He'd transformed a modest tech startup into a billion-dollar conglomerate by understanding one fundamental truth: emotion was a liability, and distance was protection. He stood in the marble entryway of his home, his hand still on the door, his body locked in an involuntary paralysis he hadn't experienced since the day he'd found his daughter unresponsive in her bed. The sound from upstairs wasn't loud, it was raw, a mother's grief stripped of all pretense, all control. It moved through the house like a shockwave, and Marcus felt it in his chest, in the place where he'd built careful walls of routine and avoidance. His first instinct was to leave, to get back in his car, return to the office, pretend he hadn't heard. His second instinct was to call his assistant and have her deal with whatever domestic crisis was unfolding on his 3rd floor. His feet carried him toward the stairs before his mind could countermand them. Each step felt like moving through water, through years, through the geography of a house he'd stopped truly inhabiting the day they'd taken Lily's body away. He knew which rooms he used: bedroom, office, occasionally the kitchen. He knew which rooms existed in theory but not in practice: the gym, the theater, the nursery. His hand hesitated on the banister at the 3rd floor landing. The door at the end of the hall, the one he paid Elena to clean weekly but never opened himself, stood slightly ajar. Light spilled through the gap, and with it, the sound that had pulled him from his car. Desperate, broken sobbing, punctuated by words in Spanish he didn't understand, but whose meaning was universal. "Please, God, no, please." Marcus moved down the hallway, his expensive shoes silent on the runner carpet. Through the narrow opening he could see her, Elena, his maid, the quiet woman who'd worked for him for, how long? A year? Longer? He realized with uncomfortable clarity that he couldn't remember. She was part of the household machinery, as invisible and essential as the climate control system. Except now she was on her knees beside the rocking chair, the chair where he used to read to Lily, where his ex-wife used to nurse her through those terrible final months. And she was holding something against her chest, something small and frighteningly still. A baby. Marcus's hand hit the door before he decided to push it, and the movement sent it swinging open with a soft creak that might as well have been a gunshot. Elena's head snapped up, her face a landscape of terror and tears, her eyes, dark brown, red-rimmed, desperate, locked onto his, and in that moment Marcus saw himself reflected back, a man standing in a doorway, powerless before the randomness of suffering, frozen between two instincts that were pulling him apart: run or stay. "Mr. Kane," her voice shattered on his name. I'm so sorry, I didn't, he was sick, and I couldn't." The service room she was trying to stand, trying to gather the portable bassinet and diaper bag with one hand, while clutching the baby with the other, trying to make herself invisible again, to restore the fiction that she didn't exist beyond her function. But her legs wouldn't support her, and she collapsed back to her knees, her body curling protectively around the infant in her arms. "Please don't fire me," she whispered. "Please, I have nowhere else. I need this job. I'll never bring him again. I promise, just please." Marcus stood paralyzed in the doorway, his mind refusing to process the scene before him in any coherent way. There was a baby. In his house. In this room. His maid, Elena, her name was Elena, had been keeping a baby in his house, and he'd never known, never noticed, never asked. The baby made a sound then. Not a cry, but something worse. A weak, rattling exhale that Marcus recognized with the visceral certainty of someone who'd heard death approaching before. His daughter had made that sound. Near the end. "How long has he been sick?" The question came out sharper than he'd intended, stripped of the usual formalities that cushioned his interactions with staff. Elena flinched. "Since this morning. I gave him medicine, but it's not he won't." Her voice broke entirely. "He needs a doctor. I know. I was about to call for help when you—" "Why didn't you?" Marcus heard himself ask, and hated the accusation in his tone. Hated that he was standing here interrogating a terrified mother instead of—
Instead of what? What was he supposed to do?
"I can't afford it." The words came out flat, factual, the simple arithmetic of poverty. "The emergency room copay is $250. I have 82.30s until Friday. And if they admit him, if he needs tests or surgery, or—" She stopped, physically unable to continue down that particular path of catastrophe. Marcus moved into the room without deciding to, drawn by a force he couldn't name. He found himself kneeling, on the floor beside Elena. His $1,000 suit pants pressing into the carpet he'd installed when Lily was born, when the world had seemed full of possibility instead of loss. Up close, the baby was clearly in distress. His lips had a faint blue tinge, his breathing was rapid and shallow, and his skin— Marcus reached out and touched the infant's forehead with 2 fingers, a gesture from muscle memory, from the countless nights he'd checked Lily's temperature during her illness. The baby was burning up. "He needs an emergency room, now." Marcus stood, pulled his phone from his pocket. "I'm calling an ambulance." "No!" Elena's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. "Please, I can't. The ambulance alone is $800, and if they—" Tears were streaming down her face now, unchecked. "I'll lose everything. I'll lose my apartment. I'll lose— He's going to die if you don't get him help." Marcus heard the brutality in his own voice and couldn't soften it. This wasn't a boardroom negotiation where everyone pretended there were no stakes. This was life and death, and he'd learned, God, how he'd learned, that money meant nothing if you waited too long. Elena looked down at her son, and Marcus watched something break in her expression. The final collapse of pride, of dignity, of the pretense that she had any control over what happened next. "I know," she whispered. "I know." The defeat in those 2 words hit Marcus harder than her panic had. This was the sound of someone drowning, going under for the last time, accepting it. He'd heard it in his own voice years ago, when the oncologist had said there was nothing more they could do. Marcus Kane made decisions worth millions of dollars every day, without hesitation. He'd fired executives, dissolved companies, restructured entire divisions with the cold efficiency of someone who understood that business was war conducted through spreadsheets. But standing in this room, this goddamned room that still smelled faintly of the lavender sachets his ex-wife had insisted on, that still held the ghost of his daughter in every carefully preserved detail, looking at this woman he'd barely noticed and the dying baby in her arms, Marcus found himself incapable of his usual calculus. The math didn't matter. The cost didn't matter. What mattered was the sound of a mother breaking, and the fact that he had the power to stop it. "Get up," he said, his voice rough. "We're taking my car." Elena stared at him, uncomprehending. "What? My car?" It's faster than an ambulance and costs nothing. Marcus was already moving, his mind shifting into the operational mode that had made him successful. Problem, solution, execution. Cedars-Sinai is 12 minutes from here. I know the chief of pediatrics. Get whatever you need for the baby and meet me downstairs in 60 seconds. He turned toward the door, then stopped, looking back at Elena, who was still frozen on the floor, looking at him like he'd started speaking a language she didn't understand. Now, Elena, he said, and there was something in his voice, not impatience, but urgency, the kind that moved people into action. Every second matters. The words broke her paralysis. She stood, moving with the jerky movements of someone in shock, gathering the baby's bag, wrapping a thin blanket around his small body. Marcus watched her for a second longer, then strode out of the nursery down the stairs, his phone already at his ear. "Jennifer," he said when his assistant answered. "I need you to call Dr. Richard Chen at Cedars-Sinai Pediatrics. Tell him Marcus Kane is bringing in an infant in respiratory distress. Tell him we're arriving in 10 minutes and I need him waiting at the emergency entrance. I don't care what he's doing. Cancel it. Mr. Kane, you have the Patterson meeting at 4. Cancel everything." Marcus grabbed his keys from the entry table, opened the front door. "Clear my schedule for the rest of the day." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Jennifer had worked for him for 8 years and had never heard him cancel anything. "Is everything okay?" "No," Marcus said, and the honesty of it surprised him. "Nothing's okay. Make the call." He hung up and stood by the Bentley, the engine already running, watching the front door of his house. 5 seconds passed. 10, 15. Elena burst through the entrance, moving as fast as her exhausted body would allow, the baby clutched against her chest, his diaper bag slipping off her shoulder. She was still wearing her gray uniform, still had her hair pulled back in the severe bun she wore to work, but her face was raw and exposed in a way that made her seem like a completely different person from the woman who'd served him breakfast for 18 months. Marcus opened the back door of the Bentley. "Get in, put him in your lap and keep his head elevated." She hesitated for half a second, the instinct of someone who'd learned that nothing came without a price, that kindness was usually just cruelty in disguise. Then the baby made that terrible sound again, and she was in the car, cradling him against her, whispering prayers in Spanish that Marcus could hear from the driver's seat. He pulled out of the driveway faster than he'd driven in years, the car's engine responding with smooth, powerful acceleration. The streets of Bel Air blurred past. Other mansions, other lives, other people who existed in the bubble of wealth that insulated them from emergencies like this. Marcus had lived in that bubble for 4 years, since Lily died. He'd built it deliberately, brick by brick, every routine and distance and carefully maintained separation, designed to ensure he'd never have to feel anything like that pain again. And now, with a woman he barely knew and her dying baby in his back seat, the bubble was shattering. "What's his name?" Marcus asked, his eyes on the road, but his attention split between navigation and the shallow breathing he could hear behind him. "Mateo." Elena's voice was barely audible. "His name is Mateo. How old?" 6 months. "Has he been sick before? Any chronic conditions?" "No, he's been healthy. Perfect. Until this morning." A sob caught in her throat. "I thought it was just a fever. I thought..." "Don't." Marcus took a turn too fast, the car's sophisticated suspension absorbing it smoothly. "Don't do that to yourself. You're getting him help now. That's what matters." But even as he said it, Marcus felt the familiar weight of his own guilt. The months he'd spent telling himself Lily's symptoms were nothing, that kids got sick, that they were being overcautious. By the time they'd gotten the diagnosis, the leukemia had already spread too far. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. "We're almost there," he said to Elena, to himself, to the baby whose breathing was getting shallower with each passing second. "Hold on. Just hold on." The Bentley screamed through an intersection as the light turned yellow, and in the rearview mirror, Marcus caught a glimpse of Elena bent over her son, her lips moving in silent prayer, her tears falling onto his fevered face. And Marcus Kane, who'd spent 4 years avoiding this room, avoiding emotion, avoiding anything that might remind him he was still capable of feeling, pressed harder on the accelerator and prayed to a God he'd stopped believing in that they wouldn't be too late. Think you know where this story is going? Think again. Part 2 is coming, and everything is about to change for Marcus, Elena, and Mateo in ways you never saw coming. Subscribe right now and turn on all notifications because when Part 2 drops, you'll want to be first in line.